And while the panelists are coming up, Corinne asked me to let you know that they will put my slides for my presentation on the website of the diocese, and so you get some direction about that. So it will be available to you.
Let me work on getting.
Dear friends, I'm not leaving in protest. I have 2 other engagements today, so I've got to get home and prepare for the next 2. But I wish you a continually blessed experience here. It's a very fascinating and engaging and needed discussion. And let us see what we can do to really, as they say, remove the walls that keep us from the other. So thank you, and again, Father, where are you? There you are. Thanks again. It's so good to have you among us. And you look no older than 49. Thank you. I invite you to do a little quick sight reading with regard to Deacon Al Turner's resume and Maria Hamm. There's a longer bio for her, and you read through it. Then it saves me like 5 or 10 minutes of introduction. And I'm delighted that they're with us, and that the Potomac River doesn't divide but unites us as a church.
Born in Cuba, but I look and dress like an Anglo, so most people don't pick it up. Therefore, people assume my heritage by looking at me and hearing my voice, and then as they get to know me, the other side comes out, usually pretty quickly. My story as an immigrant Hispanic, I came over in the early 60s. The Cubans were the first wave of Hispanic immigrants to this part of the country. The Mexicans, of course, have been here since the beginning. But I was the only Hispanic in my grade school class. I actually grew up for a while here in Northern Virginia. And I can tan quite well. And I remember a young classmate telling me in 6th grade that when he showed his mom our class picture, she said, "Oh, I didn't know you had a black kid in your class." And it really didn't bother me because I don't identify as a black, and I'm pretty sure there's some black in me because most Cubans we do have, and I have the eyes and the wide nose and the thicker lips, you know, that wonderful look. But in 6th grade, I realized for the first time that I was different. And it wasn't just because of the way I looked, it was also because I was the only Hispanic, the only foreigner in the class. And it was interesting because a couple years ago, I met up with a friend of mine who said she just loved me in 6th grade because she came in mid-year and she was from Europe. And she said, "And you were a foreigner just like me." And again, I never realized that she struggled with that as well. So how does one experience racism as a child? It's a feeling of exclusion. It's a feeling that you're not one of them. And I can honestly say that I never really experienced it because I was one of them. I was white. So this business of white privilege is very real. I can distinctly remember, though, in college when I got a full scholarship to Harvard because I was Hispanic and I was smart. And I never would have applied to Harvard because I didn't have any money. And I remember my high school counselor said, "But you're smart, and they're looking for smart Hispanics." And so again, I lucked out. I was part of this first wave of affirmative action. But I had to work my way through school, and I actually had started working cleaning houses as a 12-year-old. And I remember that was an indication of, I was 12 and we were 14 siblings. So that's how we were known in the neighborhood, the big Hispanic family. And I remember I needed to make money. We were all struggling, and so I put a sign in the local grocery store: "I'll clean your house and watch your kids at the same time." Being from a large family, I knew how to do those things. And so I made a ton of money as a teenager. There weren't any Hispanics around to do it. And so anyway, so I learned at an early age to work. I learned that this country had lots of opportunities. So for me, it was a good experience. But when I remember being at Harvard and going on a blind date, and when my friend asked me what I did in the summers, I kept doing that through college because it was good money. And when I told him I worked at cleaning houses, he kind of looked at me funny. And then I noticed he didn't talk to me much the rest of the night. And it was again, we were on a double date with my brother, and I remember just feeling sorry for him because he didn't realize that all work has dignity. And anyway, so I use those little examples. They're very small, but I asked myself, had I not had the privilege of good education, because I had a high school scholarship as well, and I would have felt very differently. And I started working with Latinas. I worked for 15 years running a pregnancy center for Latinas in Silver Spring, Maryland. And it was there that I really saw what it's like to live without this privilege. My self-esteem was very high because as a child, and there I think I saw Father Sands had the same type of experience. If you're growing up in a home where your parents are telling you that you're good and that you're worth God, and you've got that self-esteem from your family, then what other people say doesn't matter nearly as much. I mean, we all know the story of maybe you don't, of Ruby Ridges, the girl who, the young gal who integrated in Alabama, and the psychiatrist he taught at Harvard, Robert Coles, who was assigned to be her helper in doing this, he saw that as she was walking through the crowds of whites screaming at her to integrate this black school, she was an 8-year-old girl. And she was saying something, she was mouthing words. And so he asked her one day, well, what were you saying? And she said, I was praying for them. And her parents had taught her that these are the people you need to pray for. We're not the ones that need the prayers, they need them. And again, it shows again how important those early childhood experiences are in forming you. And that's the privilege we have of our Catholic faith, which the Latinos, to a large degree, have had. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, but it means if you know who you are, you can stand up to it much better. Now, reflecting on racism, I also realized that I had to break out of the cycle because I have to admit my mom was very racist. And again, it comes from ignorance. She never went to college. She was raised in Cuba. We have this situation where we have a lot of intermarriage. We have a lot of racial mixed people. And so it was very natural for it to not be as big a deal as it is here. And yet, at the same time, if you were, lily white, you stood up for that. You thought that was better. Now I have to admit too that my dad, on the other hand, was totally comfortable with all races. And I think, again, it was his experience of being in the working world, whereas my mom was in a more protected environment in the home. And I have to say, luckily, my education in this country and in Catholic schools in particular gave me a better understanding of what it feels like to be on the receiving end, as well as my adult work. So I want to leave you with a couple of points. One is, begin with yourselves. Do that hard work of examining your life. I don't know if any of you read, I thought it was a fascinating book, Unspoken Grace by this black CNN journalist here in Washington. She's actually Catholic. And it was such a great testament. She wrote this book because when Obama was being elected, she started having these conversations on racism on her show, and then she went into her own family history and discovered some things that she didn't realize had happened to her parents. And the Unspoken Grace, which is the title, was that she said her parents never talked about these things because they didn't want to give her this negative outlook as a child. They wanted to, it was an unspoken grace. They kept it to themselves so that she could experience a different life and not be encumbered with all of the negative stuff that they experienced. Again, you can argue about back and forth, but I think as a child, you need that unspoken grace. And I think to a large degree, my parents did the same. There was a lot of bitterness about what happened in Cuba, but they decided, you know what, we're in this country and we're making a fresh start and we're not going to dwell on the past. And that was an unspoken grace that they gave me. So begin with yourselves, look at your lives, pull out what's good, and try to get over what's bad. I mean, I realized with my mom, it got to the point where I was mothering her. I was more mature than her. And I could accept that because she hadn't been given the same education. Then second is to take that effort that you've made with yourselves and help educate others. You know, seek out those documentaries, those movies that are going to make you stop and think. Read books. I remember one wonderful book, Return to Glory by Joel Freeman. It's a wonderful book on race relations. And it's written by a white man who was a pastor to the Wizards, the Washington Wizards basketball team. And he had to counsel these black men. And he realized, again, the lack of self-esteem in their history. So he wrote these books about black history. Very, very good resource, I thought. And I used to share them with friends. I've given them all away. I'm going to buy some more. Learn how to open the discussion. I think one of the problems with opening the discussion is how to set the other person at ease. And you know, one trick I learned years ago in some communication class was when you have to talk about something difficult, try to frame it with, I used to think such and such, and then I learned such and such, and now I think such and such. And that way, you relax the other person because you don't come off as a know-it-all. You come off as somebody who, you know, I remember one of the things that I thought about with this, preparing for this talk, which I have to say, I didn't sleep very well last night because it's not a topic that's comfortable to me. Now I lost my train of thought. Anyway, help to educate yourselves and help to have this discussion with others. Bring it up even if it's uncomfortable. Having deep discussions about race and racism is one of the toughest things you will ever do. As the director of the Pregnancy Center, we had an African-American counselor. We had 5 Hispanic counselors, all from different countries. I mean, again, people tend to think of Hispanics as one group, but we had different classes. We have also the social class thing going on in the Hispanic community. So we had to constantly learn to hear each other out. And I remember one of my Hispanic counselors saying to me one day, I can't counsel this gal who is African American. And then out came all of these incidences in her life as a young child, walking to school as a Hispanic and being teased by the African American girls. So, you know, different experiences that different people have. And you know, we had to talk through that, and we had to, you know, have her learn to, yes, you can counsel Hispanics, and we can figure this out. Then one warning I would say, which has happened to me on occasion, don't fall for the false solutions, and there are many out there. I went to a talk in a parish a couple years ago, and I was shocked because the speaker basically said, what we need to solve this problem is power and money. You don't solve the problem of power and money by more power and money. and these were intelligent people, believe me. I had to stand up at the end and say, wait a minute, what about what Christ taught? And again, I was so happy to hear Father Sands, you know, bring up his faith, because that's the difference. I mean, Christ died on the cross. It was not fun. And it wasn't neat and tidy. It was a very messy day for him and everybody around him. And so we've got to look. I've also seen this working at the UN with the radical feminists. They're so intent on creating an equal world that they're creating an unreal world We have to stick with our gospel values because only the truth will set us free. And again, there you have to always pull back. My name is Mary, but I'm definitely a Martha. I want to get in there and fix it. But I've had to learn over the years that you got to pull back. You have to be in touch with our Lord. You have to be in touch with yourself. And you can't give what you don't have. It's only through the strength of what God gives you that you can give to others. And that's my last point. Look at holy people who have overcome great odds and see how they did it. Beginning with our Lord and the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's a starting point. Everyone's our neighbor. The Great Commission. As long as you did it for one of these, you did it for me. And then wherever two or more are gathered in my name, I am there. And here we are gathered in his name, and he's here, and he's trying to help us. We're so lucky that, one last thought. When working with Latinos and people who are, in poverty, there's no end to their problems. I mean, one of the biggest lessons we learned at the pregnancy center is that pregnancy was usually the least of their problems. They came over with coyotes, they were in abusive relationships, they had other children with other men. It was just a myriad of problems. And what can you do in a 40-hour counseling session? So one of the biggest mantras that we used to repeat all the time is, you're not the entire body of Christ. and basically, you have to give them a lifeline. And that lifeline is God. If you can connect them with God, everything else will eventually fall in place through many highs and lows. And then, God and something very practical for them to do. I remember asking, I have my oldest daughter is a nun and she works in East Harlem and she's in one of those churches that was closed. But the amazing thing is they closed the church, but they kept the school open. So that can be sometimes a solution for these inter-parishes because, big old church. She's got the convent, which is big old convent. But anyway, she said to me, Mom, when we work with the homeless, we say to ourselves, we make one lousy decision after another. And it was very heartening. It's the same about you're not the entire body of Christ, in the sense that you're going to make the best decision you can make with what you have at hand, and then leave the rest to God and keep going forward. And you're not going to see the end, and you're not going to see the end result. A lot of the times you're just sowing the seed. I remember many times when things seemed absolutely impossible, and years later I would bump into one of the girls and she would tell me how things had worked out. Never easy, but if you have the right things in place, if you know who you're working for and what you're working for, it'll fall into place. Thank you.
Yeah, what she said. I grew up in the Northeast of the United States, and I had lots of opportunities to be confronted with white privilege, both in a negative way and in a positive way. I too had parents who would not allow me to limit myself. And so I left Trenton, New Jersey to go away to college to a foreign land called Wisconsin. And I was one of 300 black students on a campus of 35,000. So we got to know each other. I knew almost all of the African-American students on that campus. But one of the things that I think that we as believers have to do is to follow what St. Paul says in his letter to the Corinthians, the first letter of the Corinthians. As the body is one, though it has many parts, and all the parts, though many, are one body, so also Christ. For in one Spirit we are all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, slaves or free persons, and we were all given to drink of one Spirit. Now, if we live our lives as though we believe that, then we will begin that day when racism is no longer a part of the fabric of this country. I consider myself a student of history, and the history of the United States of America is a history that is steeped in racism. It is founded on racism, otherness of people. And one of the things that we as Catholics have to understand is that we are complicit in the society in which we live in. One of the things that I like to study is what I call the defining moment in the United States, and that's that 4-year period in the middle of the 19th century called the Civil War. That didn't just happen. Okay. There were a lot of things that led up to the inevitability of a civil war, because the better angels of some of the people in this country said enough is enough. We can't keep doing this. Okay. And some folks in the North were pretty smug about who they were. Well, we don't have slavery up here in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and all that. However, they had a thriving textile industry. Now, where did that cotton come from?
Yes.
And so we have to look at that. And then that's part of that white privilege thing that we've been skirting around here today. And so we have to face up to the reality of what happened. Until we, as a nation, come to grips with what really happened, then healing is impossible. We have got to address it. You know, sometimes that healing hurts. You know, when they put that alcohol on that open wound, it stings, but not very long. And it does heal. One of the things that came up for me, and Father Henry said it so well, is the stories. The stories that happened. My wife and I took a little vacation after I left the Office of Black Catholics, and we wanted to do a little historical thing. Again, that's my thing. So where did we go? We went to Charlottesville. And there's a little place outside of Charlottesville that's called Monticello.
Oh, yeah.
One of the founding fathers of this nation lived there in comfort, although he died broke. But that's another story. And I hadn't been to Monticello in about 12 years or something. I'd been there. Every year they have the swearing in of new citizens on the 4th of July. And that was the last time I'd been there. That was during the Clinton administration. So we went there, and they've added something that's very important. They're facing the true face of Monticello. Monticello was a plantation. There were human beings enslaved on that property for years, for decades. And they didn't pull back. The docents there didn't pull back from the reality of the situation, the duality, if you will, of Thomas Jefferson, who was proclaiming out of one side of his mouth the equality of all men and their inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all the while enslaving human beings. And it was a very enlightening experience. While we were there, we met a young man from young, he was 50 years old, so he's younger than me, who was at once appalled by the fact that he didn't know about the slave face of Monticello. I mean, he followed us around all day, and we met him over at Monroe's house, which is right down the street, literally. And he expressed his chagrin at being white from Philadelphia and not knowing this history and how that impacted him, and he resolved to do something about it. And that is to start a conversation in his particular sphere of influence. And that's what has to happen here. Racism will never be healed in this country until we have an honest conversation about what it really means and what it has done to generations of human beings in this country. Let's only talk about this country because we could go on for years about the colonial atmosphere which enslaved half of the population of this planet in one way or another, and creating that false image of otherness about people simply because of the color of their skin. Now, I have children who are half white, okay, from my first marriage. Their mother passed away some years ago. And they don't look like me. And yet, one drop makes you whole. And they have still had to deal with white privilege from the other side. And so, so I know from firsthand experience that we're not there yet. But forums like this are the way that we can start this conversation, and it's really incumbent upon you, not us sitting up here because we do this for a living and we do it because it's the right thing to do, but in every sphere of your influence, you've got to start talking about this so that we won't have any more Fergusons, that we won't have any more disrespect shown to the President of the United States simply because of the color of his skin. We cannot. If we are true to the creed of this country and the creed that we profess every time we go to Mass, we can't continue to do this. We've got to do something different. And the height of insanity is to do something the same way over and over again and expect a different result. We are not insane, are we? Thank you.